Welcome into the Living Room Disciple podcast. Today we have the pleasure of talking with Jared Stacy about the fascinating topic of conspiracy theories. Jared is a PhD candidate at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and he is studying theological ethics and conspiracy theories. If you haven't had a chance yet to check out our website, visit livingroomdisciple.com, where you can find out more about us, get in touch with us, and even support our Patreon. Now let's get into today's conversation with Jared Stacy on the Living Room Disciple, where discipleship finds a home. All right, so we are here with Jared Stacy. Jared, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Nick. Good to be here.
Absolutely. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. I live in Aberdeen, Scotland. So if you know your UK geography, that's about 2.5 hours north of Edinburgh, 8 hours north of London, in England. But I am an American, and so I'm living the expat life here with my family. We have 3 kids that are in Scottish schools, and we moved right during a lockdown in the pandemic, and a week after January 6th. And so I was a pastor in the U.S. for about 10 years and studied in evangelical spaces, was raised in fundamentalist spaces, and tracked into more broader evangelicalism. And so now I'm here and I'm studying the theological ethics section of the School of Divinity. I'm actually studying under an American who has been here in the UK for a while, but his name is Brian Brock. And then I'm also studying under a British theologian by the name of Tom Greggs. And so both of them are my supervisors, so I get a little bit of the best of both worlds. So we've been here for coming up on 3 years. And it's important, I think, to mention too, like I am an American, I'm from the States, and a lot of the things that I experienced, not just in the pastorate, but also growing up in these spaces, is directly kind of coming out of my research. So as much as this sounds like a very formal project of doing research, it is very personal to me, and I thought that's been very helpful.
Right. So tell us a little bit about that. What interested you so much in studying this that brought you across the Atlantic? What are you studying? What are your interests, and what was kind of the catalyst for that?
If I showed you my proposal, it's been a work in progress, and it's not necessarily what I came here to study. Maybe some of your readers will or listeners will identify with what I'm about to say. When we got here in 2021, I couldn't say it then, but I can say it now. My theological gravity, the system, whatever you want to call it, my way of speaking about God had collapsed as a pastor, wow. But also as someone who was trying to be a faithful Christian and follower of Jesus. And there's a lot to that I won't necessarily get into here, if only because there were a lot of strands that made coming to a place like the UK a really inviting opportunity. I had a choice between kind of continuing on as a pastor in different places or leaving the United States and kind of coming into a different culture, a different context, and to think and ask different questions. And that was kind of the decision that we made. And it wasn't just kind of a spur of the moment decision. It was a trajectory altering decision to kind of uproot our family and to come here and to take some time away. And I think one of the surprising things that we couldn't have, figured out unless we had actually come was that we found a community, a global community here in Aberdeen, but also a pretty good sizable group of expats from the States. And so that's been encouraging, in part because you've quickly come to realize, some of the things that we've seen developing in evangelicalism or traditions in the United States with our politics and our current moment that has a lot of us just kind of feeling a mixture of dread and existential crisis almost. I don't want to paint a cynical picture, but at the same time to kind of name what's going on and saying like this is the moment that we live in, and all of that kind of came to a head for us, and it was coming here has been in some ways a breath of fresh air, and listeners might be thinking, so well, I can't move across the ocean to do that, and I that was the right decision for us at the time, but it can be duplicated or replicated in various ways. I know just the changes the pandemic has wrought in a lot of our lives, and kind of questioning prior commitments or the ways that we had constructed our lives, and this is what we've kind of found ourselves in now, and it's been good and healthy, and but it was a space making measure too, where you don't really realize that your theology has kind of collapsed in on itself, and the words and the speech that you use to talk about who God is and what He's up to in the world, and what He's inviting us into and who He is. When those things fail you experience that in a way that you can't name, in a way that you can't necessarily put a finger on. And all that was happening while I was starting a PhD program, trying to be have answers or trying to provide language that I at the time I didn't really have handles on. So coming here has been helpful in finding a community.
Right, absolutely. Yes.
Kind of ask those questions.
Yeah, so you named that you went through a struggle of kind of your theology collapsing and your language for theology collapsing, and now you are studying theological ethics. And it sounds like those things are probably pretty related, that you ended up studying conspiracies, not just because it was a wild hair interest for you, but because it was personal for you. So talk a little bit about that.
So that I didn't get to that in the last question, and so I appreciate you kind of drawing that out. I'm studying conspiracy theories. I'm not just studying evangelicalism. I'm looking at how American evangelicalism is hospitable to conspiracy theory, and there's some things that we can get into with that relationship, and it's important for me to say two things. It's not something that I think is worth holding evangelicals in a like with contempt or generalizing or pathologizing. It's just saying like this is something historically that is true of a great deal of evangelical spaces that they've proved hospitable to conspiracy theory. And so I'm kind of asking theologically, why is that the case? Is there something theologically at work that makes evangelicalism a safe harbor for these sort of beliefs? And of course, it's not just an evangelical problem; it's a human problem. And so, how to distinguish that and talk about it just as evangelicals? What does that mean? But the other side of it too is that when I say I'm studying conspiracy theories, it's always perceived, and I don't fault people for this. It's like, oh, that's a very pressing, immediate issue, and part of that was the recognition that conspiracy theories it can be a window to talk about evangelicalism, precisely because conspiracy theories are kind of experiencing a resurgence and a renaissance in the United States to try and explain some of the chaotic and unexplainable events that people are trying to get a hold on and explain. And I experienced those things as a pastor. And I can say too, like there are conspiracy theories that come across my feed, and even growing up, you hear, and it's part of being American, it's part of being a human, and it's part of being an evangelical in some cases. And so this is just a window into talking about some of the theology that is at work in making these things. But it's not something I necessarily chose. It was after conversations with community here, and kind of teasing out my pastoral experience and my time in these spaces where it was almost like this process of realization only that maybe conspiracy theory is kind of a door into asking and dealing with some of the questions that I have about the tradition that I grew up in. And so I'm very much a son of this house, and wanting to live in those ruins, so to speak.
Yeah. So I do want to go through that door. I want to loop this conversation all the way back to talking about evangelicalism and the American kind of cultural climate. But let's start real simple with what is a conspiracy theory? How would you define it?
That is a good question. So this is the question that has the academic world in a fit right now because no one can quite define it. And believe it or not,
Right.
that whole thing is called It's called conspiracy theory. The study of conspiracy.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so it gets very meta very quickly. So let me just distill this. So because listeners will know when you hear it, you kind of know it. You're like, that's a conspiracy theory. You start to feel it. You start to feel it before you can actually name it. And so the way that I would define a conspiracy theory is just kind of pulled from this academic conversation, but it helps me touch grass with it. And there's two ways of thinking about this question. The first one is a very simplistic definition. That is, a conspiracy theory is any interpretation of an event that cites a conspiracy, like a group of people coming together to accomplish something. That any interpretation that cites a conspiracy as a chief cause, and so here's the thing: when we adopt that definition, most of us come out of it being conspiracy theorists. For example. The 9/11 Commission that studied what happened on September 11th, 2001. Under that definition, when they say that Al-Qaeda planned and organized 9/11, that is basically a conspiracy theory. Now, some of your listeners will kind of hear that and say, okay, yeah, that makes sense. There's another group who points out that, well, conspiracy theory is more than that, though. It's not just an explanation that it is, and what they try and do is kind of piece a broader picture of conspiracy theory together that kind of attempts to show that it performs a lot of functions and it invites people to believe irrational things. And it also meets some psychological needs. And it also helps people imagine what it is to be a good person or to be a moral person. If you believe, that one of the claims of QAnon, if you believe, that Democrats are trafficking children, and that there's a group of them who are a group of good people, righteous people who are digging tunnels under DC to smuggle these kidnapped children out, that is a moral claim. And so many of us have probably encountered this spectrum between that might be a rational explanation for why this happened, right? And that's kind of the first view of it's just any interpretation of something that says this is, a conspiracy is behind this. And then it goes all the way to the other spectrum that could almost be knocking on the door of a clinical diagnosis, where we get into, clinically diagnosed paranoia or things like that, where people believe that, there's something physiologically going wrong. So I'm kind of charting these horizons. So there's a lot at stake in how we define it. And what I'm trying to do, Nick, is kind of help us realize that a lot of the ways that we think about conspiracy theory is also inherited from theology and from a Christian imagination, going back to, and rooted even in the Bible, where we listen about angels and demons and at work in the world and in a way that we interpret our world. So that's probably more than you asked for, but those are the kind of the two major views.
No, that's fascinating.
And it is important to crucial to calling someone a conspiracy theorist, or being called a conspiracy theorist, is almost an insult in today's climate. And but conspiracy theories are shaping our political world, and we need a way to talk about it that on the one hand doesn't demonize people, and on the other hand actually names the problem with conspiratorial beliefs. And so we'll get into that a little bit, but there's some things to chew on.
There you go. So you mentioned conspiracy theories can meet psychological needs. That's so interesting to me. And it kind of touches on, why do you think people believe in conspiracy theories? Why do people fall into that trap?
I think there's a lot of reasons, and psychologically, wanting comfort or security or certainty, we're all driven to that, and no one intentionally wants to believe or believes that we believe in lies. No one willingly embraces a lie, and that's a
Right.
rational argument. But then you could also turn it around and flip it into a moral argument too. That is oftentimes in the world, some of the greatest evils that have ever been perpetrated, like the Holocaust, came from people who believed that their cause was righteous. And so the other thing about people believe conspiracy theories is that people want to believe that their decisions matter. People want to believe that they still have agency and that they can control the world around them. And one of the ways that when you feel out of control or when you are interpreting or experiencing events beyond your control, one of the ways to kind of resolve that and to get that back is by interpreting these unexplainable events in very clear-cut terms. So, for example, it's easier to believe that Dr. Fauci and the CDC are intentionally, misleading the American public than it is to say that there's a very complex situation and that things are breaking down and we don't have control over. And the other reason that people believe conspiracy is because there's historical evidence for actual conspiracies that have actually taken place. The U.S. government has lied to its
Checks
citizens
out.
before. Yeah, the U.S. government has lied to its citizens. They lied to its citizens about Vietnam. We had a president who broke into a complex and lied about it in Watergate. So when we see things like this, like conspiracy theories are powerful for a lot of reasons. That can be psychological, it can be moral, it can be political, right? But at the heart of it, I don't want to be too simplistic here, but I want to give people a handle. A lot of the reasons that conspiracy theories remain attractive, I think, is because we all want to believe that our decisions matter and that we have this level of agency that we can directly control things, and that also means our ability to interpret things that are outside of our control. And so that there's a lot of pulls toward that aren't necessarily pathological, meaning you are crazy, and yet it can turn into irrationality and those sorts of things.
Right. Yeah, I think that we are narrative-based creatures, and we want to tie together loose ends that don't necessarily fit together. We don't like complex things that don't make sense because, like you said, it's a lack of control. So when we can take two unrelated things and tie them neatly into a story bow that makes everything make sense and gives us that sense of control over the narrative, I see the pull. Absolutely. So how do we live wisely in this climate? How do we know what is true and what is false? You mentioned some conspiracy theories are true. So how do we live wisely? How do we discern?
Yeah. I think a couple things is realizing how deeply stories not just matter, but how they work for us and in some cases turn around and determine us. So to give your listeners kind of an example, I mentioned the ways that the U.S. government we've seen in the past has lied, right, over Vietnam, and how depending on how old some of the listeners are, some listeners might need to go to like Wikipedia and like look up on this, but the U.S. government was not forthcoming about how the war was going in Vietnam back in the 70s, and a lot of people had reasons not to trust the government because what they were being told and what was actually happening were two different things. Here's what's funny though. Here's what's interesting. Along in the 1970s, along comes this incredible movie. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's called Star Wars. Okay, and this incredible movie comes along.
I have.
And it takes America by storm. And what's so fascinating though is that part of the reason for Star Wars' success that we don't always talk about is because it gave everyday Americans. It resolved this cultural crisis that we don't know what's true or false. We don't know what's right or wrong. And it suddenly recast, oh, hey, you know what? There's the Empire and there's the rebels. And there's light and there's dark. And so as much as the special effects and the score and everything was just so amazing, part of what Star Wars did at a cultural level was that it invited and it helped Americans resolve some of our anxieties and fears and uncertainties. And and the reality, the irony behind all that is that America was acting like an empire in the 70s. So it's fascinating, right? That there's almost like this unnamed reality where, hey, we're behaving like this, but we identify with the rebels. We're not the empire. We're the rebels. And so stories, going to kind of draw this out, like stories work for us. They help us resolve things. They help us negotiate fears that we may not even know that we have. And I had this kind of, I could attach this to Iron Man did this too. 2008, the Iraq War was going on, and you know what? Here comes Tony Stark, who's a weapons contractor, and he actually comes out of a cave in the Middle East. That's his. He becomes Iron Man coming out of this cave in the Middle East, and it's almost too on the nose that Americans, we were tired of the war in 2008. It was failing. Here comes Tony Stark and Iron Man to resolve this tension. So let me touch grass with this and land this, though, is because the question is, how do we live as Christians in this climate, is realizing a couple things, that the stories that we seek and that we are attracted to are doing work for us in ways that we don't always realize. And so a question is asking, like, why do you want this to be true? Why do you want this to be true? And developing, this is a Romans 12:1 and 2 kind of thing, where being transformed by the renewing of our mind is not just this, it's comprehensive is what I'm saying. And realizing that one of the ways that we can diffuse this desire to reach for narratives that kind of like put our finger in a dam that's about to break and there's all these cracks so we can sense it coming apart. Sometimes those dams need to break. And sometimes Jesus is the one to do that. And one of the ways that we realize that maybe our stories are failing and we need to divest of these certain interpretations of the world is actually by proximity with people who aren't like us. Everyone carries a story and a perspective.
Interesting.
And giving people the respect to hear that. And of course, you could take that and say, well, that means I should listen to a conspiracy theorist when they're talking to me, right? Well, yeah, there's a sense in which you can be curious, you can be generous, you can have those conversations. But there's another sense, too, where if our communities are stratified economically and racially, especially if our churches are determined by those things, we're never going to encounter stories from people who aren't like us. And being able to kind of question maybe my account of the world and my interpretation of the world, even if that I call that biblical, that might not be the case. And the surprising thing for me in going through all this too is finding how committed Jesus is to disillusioning me of wrong pictures that I have of him or what's at stake.
Yeah.
And so, going from Star Wars to Iron Man to touching grass here, conspiracy theories in many ways, they do work. They resolve things. And oftentimes we don't even know the anxieties or the fears that we're carrying. And it's only in community with other people who maybe aren't like us that we kind of learn who we are too, and can better renew our minds and realize what's at stake. So that was kind of a, Star Wars, Iron Man to now, and how we touched grass and follow Jesus. I think cultivating proximity to people who aren't like us, hearing their stories, and kind of keeping a foot in the world and a foot in the Word, and developing this way of thinking, not as a conservative, not as a progressive, but really asking, what is it to be Christian? And what does it mean to be Christian in America? What does it mean to be Christian in my community?
Right.
And a lot of the draw towards conspiracies is because we have assumptions that we're not willing to examine. And so conspiracy becomes a very easy way to gloss over our accounts of seeing the world. And sometimes, Nick, we call that being faithful. And I think I want to press on that a little bit and say there's a lot of assumptions that go into the idea of a biblical worldview that can be culturally conditioned, and that upon further closer examination might be more American than Christian. And that's something that we can kind of poke at and prod at without any fear of being threatened or giving up faith in Jesus. There's a wider area where we can allow ourselves to be disillusioned and then actively divest ourselves from stories that simply don't work and don't give an account, but they serve us in key ways.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the things that has driven Phil and I in this podcast is a few years back, we read the book together, Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes by Dr. Randy Richards. We got to interview him on this podcast recently as well. And just learning to unravel, like you said, the cultural assumptions that we have from being Americans and evangelicals versus the world that the Bible was written into and what Jesus and the apostles and even in the Old Testament, the way they thought about the world differently and how that shaped their view of what it meant to be a Christian or of being faithful to Yahweh. And so you talk about the power of stories and the way you described Romans 12:1 really hit me that so often we think renewing your mind is about receiving new information, and because you have this new intellectual information now you can renew your mind, but yeah, we are story creatures, and it's actually through receiving embodied stories that we renew our minds. It's going to be so much more effective than just getting a new piece of data. So what is the Christian story that stands against the cultural stories? What is the primary story we should believe if we want to be disciples of Jesus?
That is the question. I think I'll give some recommendations for people who are listening. Stanley Hauerwas has been saying this for a very long time in the American context. He's an American theologian, and he writes a lot about the importance of narrative and story. And he talks about the church being a storied people, and being determined by this story. And here's the relationship with conspiracy theory, right? Is that the assumption politically is that conspiracy theory is invalid because it's irrational, and there's a sense in which that can be true, but believing false things or believing untrue things. But as Christians, we have to kind of name something that quickly we assume the Christian faith is not rational. That if you try to rationalize, what I'm not saying is that it's not historic. I'm not saying that Jesus didn't have a human body, right? I'm not saying that it's that. But we confess a logic to the cosmos, a meaning to the cosmos that modern tools of rationality and modern standards of rationality cannot discover, even at their most sharpest points. What Christians confess is deeply scandalous. And some Christians will take that and kind of say, well, if my faith is grounded in an irrational conspiracy theory, then why not believe these things? And that's been the question that I've tried to unpack and driven me through my research. And I think the most important thing, though, is the danger that I see in what I'm working with is that I could try so hard to contest conspiracy theory because it's irrational and end up trading away the unique, distinctive Christian story that Paul says is the scandal and is the offense. So I want to say that because if you're asking about what is the Christian story, I would want to kind of disillusion us to say that it's somehow rational when conspiracy theories are irrational. And to say that the Christian story that the church has given witness to is a story that sees and confesses a meaning that no historical reconstruction in its purest form can get after. Now, yes, we believe that Jesus was a first century Jew. Yes, we believe that he entered history. But to go back in time and to see Jesus on the cross, you could witness that event, but you could miss its meaning. Like the centurion who nailed Jesus on the cross and said, truly, this was the Son of God. In Mark's gospel, that confession is the difference between simply bearing witness to something as a historical event and confessing. So that's the difference, confessing the meaning of that event that can only be arrived at through faith. And so when you talk about, what story are we going to? What story are we clinging to? It's sending us back into the witness of the church down through the ages. It's not a witness that has ever been perfect or ever without fault, but it is a witness that is sustained ultimately by the Spirit. And so we are kind of floating down that river in a way that we can be determined by this story of who Jesus was and what he's calling us to in this moment. But it all comes down to that weekend in Jerusalem. It all hangs on those events. And it's incredulous. It's incredible.
Right.
And but that's the story that determines us. And the church is that sustained witness over time to that event. And that's the story that should determine us. But it is as deep as it is wide.
Right.
And so I'm preaching now, but that's the story. That's it.
Yeah, it strikes me that in a sense you could say that the Bible is the story of the triune God conspiring to send one member of the Trinity into human flesh to save the world and bring about this invisible kingdom that's remaking the entire world. Like, this sounds crazy, right?
Right.
But it's true. Our God is remaking the world, and this is what we believe. So what about evangelicalism? Now we're kind of to what you're studying. What about evangelicalism makes us prone to believe in conspiracy theories?
There's a few things, and I think what I'm finding is that there are parts of our theology that uncritically, if we hold it uncritically, we become prone to see conspiracy theory as a way to do politics, right? There's something that there's a mishandling that comes from our theology into our ethics, into our politics, and there are ways to theologically diffuse those challenges. So one of the things that I'm looking at, one of the most popular periods of conspiracy theory was in the 1950s and 60s with communists infiltrating America.
Right.
And one of the things that's very clear about evangelicalism of that era was that a lot of the revival language and the revivalism that brought evangelicalism mainstream through Billy Graham and Harold Akenga and others like these names that some of you might know, the similarity in all of these revivals was that there was almost an assumption that to be Christian was to be American, and to be American was to be Christian. And you could probably push that even farther, right? To say that we've confused being white and all the cultural realities that brings up. To be white is to be Christian, and to be Christian is to be American. And so it brings in the race question and how race in many ways has determined America and has shaped how we understand Christianity and evangelicalism, and then has expanded to determine the way that we think about society and politics. And so when you see being Christian and being American as almost the same thing, or a lot of the revival language of that period, 1950s, basically assumed, right, if you become a Christian, then you will become this particular type of American citizen. And that American citizen was always the one who was not going to defeat the communist conspiracy that was threatening America. So we have a very complex and almost very close relationship with the American state that makes us prone to see threats to America as threats to Christianity. And so there's a whole host of anxieties that come with making that commitment and confusing those two things. Another one goes back even farther in our history to the Great Awakenings and some of the preaching there, and our willingness also to overlook the political and focus on people's souls to the neglect of their bodies. And so refusing in some ways to address slavery back in the 1700s. So yeah, there's I'm kind of glossing over it. There's a lot that I want to get into, and I'm kind of policing myself and saying that there's a lot to get into. But I'd say two things. One of the reasons that evangelicals are prone to conspiracies is just evangelicals are like everybody else, and we want certainty. We want we want all those things. We want to be able to have control. But then there's things distinctly about our evangelical upbringing and seeing the church maybe as what is necessary to make America survive or make America work. And that when you start, Hauerwas says, when you start believing that the church is required to make America work, then you are very quickly going to be determined by the story that America tells about itself and not the story of the church.
Right.
And so there's a whole host of ways that door theologically can be opened. And usually it comes from confusing or equating things that ought not to be equated, like the church and America, or Christian identity and American identity. And so that lets in a whole host of kind of anxieties. You take these things on, and conspiracy theory can be a way to kind of maintain and resolve all the anxieties that come with trying to take America back for God. I've said it once, and I think this is kind of the point I'm trying to make, is that why did all these claims about the election being stolen from Trump find a safe place to live in evangelicalism? And partially it's because for 20 to 30 years, evangelicals have heard from a variety of places that not only are Democrats a political opponent, but they're evil. And so it's the question of stealing an election is not a question of whether or not it could happen. It's based on an assumption that Democrats are the kind of people who would do that. And so conspiracy theory, it takes seriously trying to understand evil and how it works in the world. But what it tends to do is it tends to project evil outside of our community, and it tends to find it in others. And then that kind of turns around and has this self-justifying effect where it's like, well, we're not the ones with the problem. It's out there. And if the church is a community that's supposed to witness to this story, it's really hard to give a witness when we're not leading the way in naming our own evil and our shortcomings and failings. And a refusal to do that can show up as conspiracy theory. And so it's a lot easier to, believe these things about the social or political worlds than it is to treat the darkness that is within with the sort of seriousness that it demands. And I think Jesus leads us to do that. His spirit at work in the church is actively drawing this out, sometimes against our will even, and bringing it into the light.
Fascinating. It strikes me that you mentioned in the 50s we fell guilty to saying that being American was crucial to being Christian. And then by the 70s, ironically, again, you mentioned that we had become the empire that we were fighting against. So American identity being intrinsic to being Christian became absolutely untrue. We recently got to talk to Dr. Scott McKnight about his book on Revelation, and just the way that he talked about the way Revelation presents Babylon as this anti-kingdom of God empire, and the way that America falls into so many of those descriptions. And we as Christians, we have to be so faithful to the kingdom of God that allegiance to another empire is unacceptable, right? And that's not to say that we can't be grateful for our nation or things like that, but when we start to give loyalty that belongs to the kingdom of God to a here on earth kingdom or empire, that's where we've lost the plot. And I think that's so helpful. So as most of our listeners, I think, would define themselves as evangelical. Phil and I define ourselves as evangelicals in America. And so when we find ourselves in these environments and we talk to other evangelicals that have believed conspiracy theories or are trying to even get us to believe conspiracy theories, how do we have those conversations?
Yeah, that's the question. And it's a heavy one. And I know your listeners, as well as you do, Nick, probably can recount difficult conversations and even broken or even hurting or dissolved even relationships because of this. And
Right.
that's a hard thing to go through. And so I remember I told my daughter, she's 6. I said I told her a little bit about what Dad's studying, and I just said I try to help people, including myself, think about Jesus and think about Jesus in ways that we haven't thought of Jesus. And she just without even missing a beat, she goes, "Have you changed anyone's minds?" and that was such an honest question, and that's the question behind the question, right? It's like and no, we can't change people's minds. You can't, and there's scientific evidence to back this up, but that's not the determining question, right? Whether or not people who believe conspiracy theories can change their mind, that's not the reference point that I'm working from here to say, well, if you argue with a conspiracy theorist, chances are they're only going to double down. That scientifically, that there's research to back that up. So it's worth mentioning. But the more important challenge that I've tried to bring to the table that doesn't get heard, because the way that our political environment deals with conspiracy and disinformation is by Facebook fact checking and by Twitter fact checking and through censorship measures and things like
Right.
that. So the question I have is, well, how do we do this as church? And what we're failing to realize in these evangelical spaces that you are in and that your listeners are in, and I say this as someone who was in these spaces when I lived in the States, is that to confront a conspiracy theory in a Christian community actually starts a theological crisis. Because people don't believe conspiracy theories in Christian community outside of who they are as Christians and what they believe as Christians. So when you have in
Right.
evangelicalism people believing and buying conspiracy theories, they may talk about Donald Trump and Stop the Steal. They may talk about QAnon, but there's theological authority that is giving them a legitimacy to talk about and claim these things. And so I think that in some ways should inform our approach more than the rational. And it may be frustrating to hear that because you say, well, come on, man. Like, can I just tell my neighbor that no, like Joe Biden is not a robot? Can I just tell them that? And there might be a sense in which that conversation could happen. But how do we do this as church? How do we do this as Christian people? And there's two things that I would come up with. Is the first is simply this. It is prayer. It is prayer. That prayer has a formative effect on us as the one communicating, but it's communication. So we receive as much as we give, and if we know as Christians who confess this, we receive way more than we give. And so I don't want to diminish that in any way, and say like prayer actually can be central to helping us think about how to relate with people in our lives or in Christian spaces that bring conspiracy and kind of are oriented around a faith that says like my political conspiracy theories are the chief expression of the way I show my faith. So prayer would be the first one, and then I think the second one is simply this is this idea of proximity and long suffering and hospitality. So let me unpack those. Proximity, long suffering, and hospitality. Is that proximity is so many of our communities in the church in America is largely not determined by theological realities, but it's determined by socioeconomic and partisan realities. That when you invite your church over, we all in some ways look the same. The church in America is still very segregated and fragmented. And so realizing that we have to work as followers of Jesus even more to cultivate the kind of proximity to people who are not like us, who may actually share the faith that we share but are different, and whose stories and experiences might actually cause us to think about our theological speech a little differently. And so that takes work, which is where long suffering comes in, is there needs to be an amount of patience, an amount of dedication of saying, you know what, like I cannot control what you believe or how you believe it, but I'm not going to necessarily remove myself from, I'm not going to extricate myself from the situation. So long as we're a part of this Christian community and this reality, like we're going we can talk about this, but there's a level of commitment there that runs deeper. And that's the final thing, is this idea of hospitality, where there is breaking bread and a shared life and all of those things coming together. And so, there needs to be a sense of belonging that kind of supersedes the need to tell people that they're right, or that they're wrong. And so that's not a toolkit for changing people's minds. That's a toolkit for building a community that is okay with difference and okay with ambiguity and okay with uncertainty. We're all trying to figure it out. And that's not to justify or legitimize conspiracy theory, because I could come right on the back end and say this: is it ever okay to believe a conspiracy theory? And here's what I would say. Conspiracy theory should never be the basis for moral or political decisions. You should not base your moral trajectory or make political decisions on the basis of what you've heard a political party is doing or a certain candidate is doing. Christians of all people, because of our confession, can be okay with not knowing. And one of the things my supervisor here says, Brian says, is really good. Is, the only thing that the church knows that the world doesn't is who sustains the world. That's it. And that takes a lot of things off the table, right? It takes a lot of things off the table, and yet it puts everything on the table. Because if you believe that God sustains this world, then suddenly it's no longer an antagonistic culture war. Suddenly it's, how do I relate to this person loved by God?
Yeah.
And that resets, that's a renewing of the mind that resets the table to have a different kind of interaction. And it's not an interaction that ignores the way that conspiracy theory saps our political will to solve problems, but it does change how we think about other people. And that goes for conspiracy theorists, and that also goes for people who would just try to change their mind rationally. And so the church has a place for this and has a voice that I think we can restore and rescue if we're intentional and if we think back on what it means actually to be determined by the Christian story.
Yeah. Well, what a beautiful, perfect note to end on, Jared. I'm so grateful for your time today. I'm grateful for your wisdom. Where can we find you online? Where can we keep up with what you're up to?
I'm gonna say I'm writing my dissertation like a madman, so I'm not gonna say. No, I'm just kidding. I would really. I'm on Instagram, Jared M Stacy, and then I'm on Twitter at Jared Stacy, and I'll be there. I'm pretty active on Twitter, and I say that probably to say this is that I'm very open to hearing experiences that people are having with conspiracy theory, and open to fielding questions about it, and helping people navigate that is like I said, people sometimes just have those questions when they hear them studying conspiracy theory, and it's how do I navigate this or walk through this? And,
right.
So, yep.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your pastoral heart for guiding us and being a resource for us. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Thanks for having me, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Living Room Disciple podcast today. I'm praying that the conversation between Nick and Jared was as exciting for you as it was for me. It's a topic we're really interested in. In fact, if you have topics that you're interested in and want us to approach them here on the podcast, go ahead and head over to our website, livingroomdisciple.com, and you can actually fill out the contact form and send us podcast ideas, speaking requests, and all the things. You can also find out ways to support us on Patreon. Information on Jared Stacy, where to find him online, is going to be in the show notes. Make sure to follow him. He has an amazing column that he writes, and you should absolutely check it out. Huge shout out to Anissa Live for getting all the production done, to Eric Church for making sure that this episode gets out into the world, and for Daniel Ramirez, who did all of our music for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home.